G'day everyone. This is the second of our videos for week 6 of our Legal Ethics and Trust Accounting course. Last week we started looking at our duties to the client, and this week we're continuing that theme by looking at the duty to keep client information confidential. In the first video we outlined that duty in general terms, and we learned that information attracts the duty of confidence if it is communication with a client for the dominant purpose of providing legal advice. In this second video, we're going to look in practical terms at how solicitors comply with the duty of confidentiality in actual practice. As we learned in the first video, while we refer to this as a duty to the client, the duty actually commences before the person becomes a client. Sometimes you may be required to conduct an initial interview with the client. They might just walk through the door of the office. They might call your office on the phone, they might email or fill in a web form, and you're given the task of contacting them in return. At this stage, the person is absolutely not a client in the usual sense. They've not agreed to be represented by your firm, and you have not agreed to represent them. But in order to work out whether you can help them, or whether you want to help them, you need information. In order to work out what might be involved with their matter, you need information. In order to work out how much the whole process is likely to cost them, and therefore in order to give a sensible cost estimate, you need information. And for the client to decide whether they feel comfortable with your firm, they're going to need to give you information and gauge your reaction. All of this means that even in that initial conversation, they're going to provide you with confidential information. The information is confidential instantly, and the duty is raised instantly. Any notes that you take during that initial conversation are privileged notes. They will need to be retained either on the client file if the client actually becomes a client, or on some other file if they do not. Different firms have different practices, but one way or another you'll find that every firm has a mechanism for protecting that confidential information. These days, it's very difficult to imagine a firm that does not operate a practice management IT system, which allows you to capture on a client's file everything from emails to file notes to court documents. Most law offices are now very close to being paperless offices. Now, on the one hand, these can be very efficient and secure ways to accumulate client information to use while managing a client's matter. On the other hand, however, they can very quickly become large and unmanageable piles of documents. It's crucial that you understand from the outset that your starting position must be that every single document on every single file is privileged and must not be disclosed. That assumption is only disturbed if you can clearly see that instructions have been given to disclose. If those instructions are given by telephone, you should not just record the telephone conversation on a file note, you should email the client. Dear client, I am just emailing to confirm our telephone conversation of a few moments ago in which you instructed me to disclose X document to Y person. I explained that by doing so, legal privilege would be lost in relation to that document. I will now disclose the document as directed. Let me say it again. Every document is to be regarded as privileged and confidential unless you can clearly see that it is not. Now, for any of that to work, the client has to understand what on earth you're blathering on about when it comes to privilege. In my view, this is one area where practitioners fall down all the time. Clients need to be informed, not just in the fine print of their client agreement, but actually informed about how client privilege works, and more importantly, how it can be abrogated. They need to know that if they instruct you to send a document to the opposition, or even just a quote from a document, then legal privilege will be lost. They need to know that even if privately they pass a document to a third party, legal privilege will be lost. From our perspective as practitioners, we should not be disclosing privileged information unless we are certain that the client understands the implications of doing so. Now, a few moments ago, I briefly mentioned ways in which to record those instructions from a client if we're convinced that the client is instructing us to disclose. So, a file note, potentially an email back. Those are a good start. However, there is a better way. Every single time you send a substantive communication to anyone outside your bubble, to your opponent, to the court, to an expert, anyone else, you should prepare that correspondence in draft and then send the draft to your client together with any attachments that you plan to send on. That way you can say in the covering email, can you please confirm your instructions to send this to, and then you specifically say who you're sending it to. That way it will be clear that you have not compromised your client's confidentiality because you've only done what they instructed you to do. Face-to-face and telephone interviews can be very complicated in some ways because they're always open to interpretation. People will remember conversations differently, and even two people taking notes from the same conversation will take those notes differently. The reason is obvious. We speak between 160 and 200 words a minute. The average typist goes along at about 40 words a minute, and a good one at 80 words a minute. That's someone who's just typing, not someone who's also participating in the conversation. So any notes from any conversation are essentially going to be that person's edit of the conversation. Remember that those notes attract the privilege, and the privilege belongs to the client. By extension, those notes belong to the client. If you write anything in those notes, be prepared for the client to see them. You can see that it's a much better idea for you to scribble madly during the meeting, then assemble an email to go back to the client to record your view of the meeting. The notes will still be privileged, but they're just notes. You can cheerfully shred them because you've now assembled a proper record of the meeting. Now, since early 2020, the whole world has been turned upside down by COVID-19. The law has been no exception. In December 2019, Zoom meetings with clients were still an unusual cutting-edge practice. By April 2020, they were standard. And as we all know, Zoom and similar technologies allow you to record meetings. Video recordings are interesting documents because sometimes they're privileged and sometimes they're not. The question is whether the video recording was made in circumstances of confidentiality. So a Zoom meeting between a lawyer and a client, where the client is sitting alone in a private room, is quite likely to attract the privilege. However, the same Zoom conversation, in circumstances where the client is sitting in a public place, might well not attract the privilege. Again, it's always going to be better to reduce the meeting to documentary form. Next, I want to talk about email and confidentiality. Email is no longer a novel tool. It's a measure of my age that I completed my first degree before I even obtained an email address. But my first email address was still more than 25 years ago. The disclosure of a confidential email to anyone but the client risks the loss of the privilege. If you CC or blind CC another recipient, this can be enough to remove the privilege because the communication is no longer between you and the client. If you inadvertently hit reply all, then there are ethical rules about not taking advantage of an opponent's error. But if your opponent can argue that you deliberately hit reply all, then any confidential material in that communication may lose its confidential status. It's good practice to very deliberately confirm the recipients before hitting send. And it's good practice to open up every single attachment to be certain that you are only sending the documents that you intend to send. Okay, the last practical issue I want to discuss is disclosure. Disclosure is part of the civil procedure process, and it usually involves each party providing to the other party a list of all the relevant documents they have in their possession. The list of documents is usually divided into two: documents in respect of which privilege is not claimed, and documents in respect of which privilege is claimed. The second category are usually dealt with in bulk, so the list will simply say various items of correspondence between the plaintiff and solicitors in relation to which privilege is claimed. However, someone has to look at each document on the file and decide if it is privileged. This is a slow and laborious process, and it's often handed to a junior solicitor, partly because it's boring and partly because it's time-consuming and junior solicitors come cheap. If you are detailed the task of preparing a list of documents, ensure that if there is any doubt at all about whether a document should be disclosed, You must seek the guidance of a more experienced practitioner because it's an ethical breach to disclose confidential information, but it's potentially a contempt of court to fail to disclose unprivileged information. It's important to get it right. So there are a few practicalities of how the privilege is brought to life in actual practice. Next, in the final video for this week, we're going to look at the exceptions, circumstances in which the privilege may be removed or lost.